Welcome. Good to see you. We've got a spot right over here. Lucky you. We've got room at the chef's table. Bon appetit.
Well, hello everyone.
How's it going?
Welcome to A Minor Diner, where we take a recent music release, give it a theme, and pair it with two other works of art to create a three-course meal. We've got our appetizer, our entree, and our dessert to make the meal du mois, our meal of the month. I am your base chef, Zach, and I am here with my treble chef, Jesse.
Hello, everybody.
We are happy to see you again. It's...
Always great to see new friends. We've got,
Wait. No, don't try to blow past that. What the hell was that?
What?
The whole building was just shaking.
It does? It has.
Don't pretend you didn't notice that. It does it like every hour these days since you started whatever the hell you were doing down there.
Doing where?
In the wine cellar. You're digging in the wine cellar.
That's got nothing to do
What?
with...
Are you digging under the foundations?
Foundations?
Yeah. You know the concrete layer down there under the supports?
Oh, yeah, I'm way past that. No.
No. How far down are you going? What the hell? And why? This place is collapsing.
It'll be fine. It's just settling.
What? Are you looking for treasure down there? You going to find some crypt or cavern full of Aztec gold?
I actually found some arrowheads. Look.
Oh, that's actually kind of sick.
Yeah, that one's kind of cool. I think it's like flint or something.
Huh. Well, your discovery there actually kind of ties into this month's theme. Interpreting Antiquity.
Humankind has a very long tradition of art, philosophy, religion, etc. Some of these traditions and ways of thinking can still be applied to our lives, like the venerable Socratic method. However, we might be better off if some of them died off. Like that thing where they put suction cups on your back. What is that, like cup therapy or something?
King's cup, flip cup.
But anyway, how do we decide which of these traditions to keep and which to throw into the river? How do we interpret the works of the past?
We were inspired this month by the recent release of Pan Daijing's third album entitled Tissues. We've paired this post-industrial opera work with a 3rd century BC religious text and a 1958 Japanese film. Coming to the table live from the kitchen, we've got our appetizer.
Okay, so here at A Minor Diner, I know that it gets discussed a lot, but your base chef, Zach, lived for a few years in Vietnam, and your treble chef, Jesse, lived in China for a few years. And so whenever we get a dish in from one of these places, I think it causes a different sort of stir in the restaurant.
It takes it always opens up a special piece of your heart. There's not that many dishes that come in from Vietnam, unfortunately.
Sure. And so we got this kind of big mysterious truck backed up to the restaurant to unload this dish, and I got to say that I am positively levitating right now, vibrating from excitement, that we here have Pan Daijing's, this is her third album technically, called Tissues.
Tissues, yes. And just as, I guess I'll do a disclaimer before we get into this. When you are a chef, you have to kind of, I guess, balance. I don't want to say lowbrow and highbrow, but some dishes are very easily eaten by everyone. Like
Yes.
Anybody who comes into the restaurant is going to enjoy this.
Yes,
right?
It would be very difficult for us to like serve a Beatles album unironically. It's
Exactly.
a little too. It's like bread.
It's like
unlimited bread.
But
sticks.
everybody likes bread, but
Yeah.
bread is a little bit familiar. It's a little bit, boring. You don't come to A Minor Diner for bread.
Right.
But there are some dishes that are very complex, and they kind of take a certain taste to truly enjoy them. And the dish that we just brought to the table for the appetizer is definitely one of those.
Yes, this thing has been simultaneously fermenting for 400 years, and also like if the second you open it, you have to eat it because otherwise it's going to expire. So Pan Daijing is basically, she is a experimental artist in literally every sense of the word, in multi-mediums. She is from Guiyang, China. And the thing about Guiyang, China is that obviously, dear diner, you probably don't recognize the name, and that's because that's an actual Chinese city. In China, there's a general sort of tier system to the cities. So Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, like the big cities, those are tier 1. Yep. And so those are those are synonymous with like a London or France or New York or whatever. And then there's tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. I don't know where Guiyang, China is on that tier list or whatever, but like proportional to the rest of their population and everything, it's basically like saying I'm from Kansas City, Missouri. Like it's an actual, the heartland of China down there in the south. And the only reason to harp on this so much is that China has basically 56 different ethnic groups, so to speak. And their culture, at one point, they had 350 different types of opera alone, because China today is this like big unified concept, but throughout history, it's a bunch of different people from a bunch of different places. And so Pan Daijing is born and raised in Guiyang, China, but now she works and resides in Berlin. And
the place where you've got to go if you're going to make experimental kind of electronic music.
It's literally like, just the line of deviation it's just a straight line between her and like Kraftwerk, David Bowie, Iggy Pop sort of thing of like, I want to be weird and experimental and different and play with the past. And it's been the same thing.
Because it's interesting. I mean, I don't know how many diners come in here very well versed in like modern Chinese music. I would say like I probably listen to a few albums from China every year, but most of them are from major cities. Like most of the artists are from, this is a band from Beijing or this is a band from Shanghai, because those are cities with that kind of musical culture.
Yeah.
Guiyang is not, all right? It's the capital of Guizhou province, which is one of the poorest provinces in China. As you kind of mentioned, it is one of the most diverse regions of China. But just to it's not like it's a backwoods village. Like
no.
There's still
there's millions of
5 million people that live there, which makes it bigger than every U.S. city but New York City. Even though it's like, I have no idea, but there's probably 25 to 50 cities bigger than this.
No, exactly. Because I looked that up. It's the 36th biggest, which is like Kansas City.
Yep.
Because, like Beijing has, I believe it's like 25 or 30 million people there. Yeah, and it's insane. So she comes from this, again, the reason to harp on this is like, well, I'm born and raised in LA or New York or whatever, and I'm an artist. It's like, okay, you have that very distinct opinion, at least here in America. If you hear artists of any genres from Kansas or California or Washington or whatever, you kind of know a little bit of what they're bringing into it. And so she comes from like China. And when a lot of people say from China, it's like Wuhan, Guangzhou, Shanghai, Beijing, where a lot of that is very metropolitan, very globalized. It's somewhat synonymous with New York, LA, Paris, whatever. For her to be from here, and then I would argue probably pretty clearly not wanting to actually live and make art in that city, to then go to Berlin and basically in a very fun like Jackson Pollock or even less so, like just start throwing stuff at the wall to throw stuff at the wall. She basically starts telling people in 2019 that I don't know, I'm not like classically trained, don't really understand music theory, or I haven't been taught music theory in the classic sense, but I'm writing an opera. I'm making an opera. And everyone's like,
which is bold.
Yes.
That's a big push.
You go, girl, for sure. And so this comes out very recently, Tissues. It is basically 4 movements that are all together as one track, and I believe it played at because it's part of an art installation.
Yeah, so it played in 2019. It played at the Tate Modern, which is a pretty highly well-respected modern art museum. This is just an excerpt from her 5-act opera of the same name, Tissues. So this isn't the piece in its entirety, but essentially the first 2 full-length albums that she put out, they're still very heavily experimental. They're still very heavily like industrial, I guess is the word that you could use to describe them. Kind of more like creepy industrial soundscape kind of stuff, with some heavy experimentation, but it essentially kind of lived in that realm. And this is her first foray into taking that sound palette, that experimental sound palette, and then applying it to this art form that has been around since forever.
Yes, yeah. And that's, I think, if we can come out and say it, like, I love it. I think it's awesome. I think it's like, I am 100% for sure guilty of being on like a high horse where I prefer opera and I prefer classical music to most other kinds of music. But then like some notch under that would be radically like weird experimental. Like it's either got to be, if it's pop, it's got to be like Carly Rae Jepsen, like perfect diamond cut, like perfect, or classical music, whatever, or something bold and ambitious like this where it's really trying to move the medium forward. And I couldn't call it Carly Rae Jepsen. It's not quite hitting all 3 of those, but it's like she is basically taking it blows my mind how not pretentious this is, because she doesn't know, she's not raised like Mozart to like understand the DNA of opera. But if you ask the average person, like, what is opera? Like, what are the general tropes and trappings? It's like that Bugs Bunny or that Looney Tunes episode of A Night at the Opera, where it's like, you know, the fat lady sings and these big horns and orchestral, like basically like Wagner stuff. And she sort of takes this mix because like when I was in Beijing, I didn't go see any Peking opera because at that time it's more of like a touristy thing to do. There's not like super legitimate ones. But there's like a couple that like this reminded me of in whatever sort of way. There's a few: Farewell, My Concubine, The Ruse of the Empty City, Orphan of Zhao Family, A River All Red, Phoenix Returns Home, Drunken Concubine. And this doesn't sound like Peking opera to whatever degree, but like the subject matter and like the way, because like take for example Richard Wagner, where it's like this big giant, we're going to take Norse mythology and tell a big story, and it's going to have characters that have arcs and this and this and this. Chinese, or at least Peking opera, is a lot more like, here's this one situation, this one, like imagine something that's like half the scale of a Shakespearean drama, where it's like, we have this problem, this person's going to come invade the city, we have to come up with a solution, here are the players, here's what they tried, here's how it went, sort of thing. And you listen to this, and there's these 4 very distinct movements that you can almost like, it's like incredible when I think it's the intro to the 3rd movement when that giant piano like hits. And it's like this ascension to heaven or descent to hell or whatever we're doing here. Because it's about emotion is what I've read from her. And I think that it's this interesting way in which, my general point being that I think Pan Daijing has captured what a lot of artists sort of stroke their own egos pretending that they captured, where she readily acknowledged that she doesn't, this is an opera, but this is not, I'm not versed enough in opera. Contrast this with like The Who, with Tommy, where it's like, it's a rock opera, and it's like, it's a musical. It's like, it's not an opera, it's a musical. It's fine, but calling it an opera is a little insecure.
Grandiose.
Yeah, but she does this, and in my mind, like the grand metaphor I would give it is like, there are still opera houses, and there are still, we still revere it to some degree. But those spaces, compared to how they used to be, they are not as filled. Those are empty, quiet places compared to what they were built for. And so she's coming in there and basically filling it with the only unpretentious thing you can, where it's like, I respect this space, but I can't do it justice, so I have to do my thing my way. And I would argue that level of authenticity is just as good as any like classical 1800s, 1700s opera.
I agree. And I think learning more about her upbringing kind of, I guess, informs this sound and informs her decision to make an album like this, or a piece like this, I suppose. She basically says, like, when she lived in China, she never left until, I guess, university. She went to study abroad, as many Chinese, like, very good Chinese students do.
Yeah.
And she says when she was a kid, she just, like, did her studies. She just studied all the time. She just played sports. She called herself a happy, boring kid. And she had, like, she didn't really listen to music. None of her family like listened to music, because that's what I hear a lot of the time when you read interviews with musicians. It's like, oh, my parents got me into this, or I found this at a young age, and it kind of like informed my entire life. But she said she really only started getting into music during the last few years. She lived in China, and then when she moved abroad. So she's got this quote that says, I feel like I spent all these days listening and reading and watching, and my eyes were just so big. It was a whole world that was opened up to me. There's also a point I got really sad because I realized how much I've missed out. Everyone I met, I talked to, they have been listening to this kind of thing since they were very young. When I just started, people talked about gear and the records they knew. Do you know this? Do you know that? I didn't know anything, and I felt really bad about it. But now I completely changed my attitude. I think it's good not to know, but it's important to always learn and study. And I really like that.
Yeah, that reminds me of there's like a rush of memories that you just sort of, because like when I was over there, I was doing film work and then a little bit of theater work. And this is like a common, China is very difficult to talk about because it's like this like shorthand thing of like, if you go up to any person on the street, about China, right? And they'll say yes. And that means something very loaded one way or the other. And so what I'm about to say is more of a statement of reality rather than like an indictment of it. But like one of my good friends over there, she is like a Shakespearean actress. She's about 25, I think. And she has said like, kids growing up today, like, not that she's jealous or anything, but she's like, I'm really happy that they have it to where they're actually learning about art. Because even someone as young as her, she's like, we didn't have that. Like, you'd start learning about art in high school, and even then it's academically. Like, you're not actually being introduced to making it or anything. And you can kind of see that in the culture over there, where it's a bit extremely pragmatic of like, you need to provide for your family and provide for others. And so there's not, obviously artistic careers are the most dangerous, like, because they're unpredictable. And so they don't encourage their kids, they didn't previously encourage their kids to do that. And what I remember is you'd have those sorts of feelings of like working with any actors or actresses or artists over there. They were either so unbelievably like what's the word, like unaffected in a great way of like, they haven't been funneled into like, I'm an artist and therefore I have to think exactly like this. They're like completely unblemished minds that are going to say and do whatever they want because they haven't been instructed to do whatever.
Yeah.
Or like that, I wouldn't say that she's being insecure there, but a lot of like, oh shoot, I'm 20 and like Westerners have been listening to the Beatles since they were 5. I just started listening. And so it's like this playing catch up. And that's why I think it's like so remarkable of her to like approach this space, because especially as because it's also interesting how she wants to choose to be identified. Because like as an American, when I would go over there, it's like, you're an American, and so you think and do this and blah blah blah, and it's like, no, there's a bit more nuance. And I can imagine she's the same way, where it's like, I'm not just Chinese, that's why I'm over here in Berlin.
Yeah.
But like, especially as a Chinese citizen, because they had 350 different types of opera that when the Cultural Revolution hits gets funneled down to like 8. I can't remember her name, and forgive me, my Chinese brothers and sisters. Whatever Mao's fourth wife was, that was part of the Gang of Four, that she commissioned. There's like 8 famous revolutionary plays, and that's it. And there was this like famous joke among people at the time of like 800 million people watched 8 shows, basically. And so it's very interesting that she would come out and basically take this sort of Chinese inspired attitude, because you are where you grew up, you take your influences with you, and then because when you hear European opera, like my eyes kind of glaze over, because there's a lot of fantastic, amazing ones, but it's also like extremely pretentious. The pitfalls are there. And so for her to, like Zach was saying earlier, like in regards to dishes that we've served here at A Minor Diner, this is the one. I can imagine some diners saying like, well, I can listen to some pretty like experimental stuff.
I like everything.
Yeah. I mean, like I grew up listening to Pink Floyd. Like I can handle anything. And then you listen to like the first 45 seconds of this, and it's the classic like, well, this isn't music, or this isn't whatever. Like this truly is. It reminds me of the opposite, because I've always been annoyed at that. Like, well, when you're pregnant, listen to a lot of Mozart or Beethoven, because then the baby will get smarter. That's how things work. That's a rational argument.
Yep.
This is like the opposite, where it's like, this is like true music, whatever you'd call the opposite of like field recordings, where it's like seeing the earth for how it is or whatever. This is like what it means to be a human being in a weird way, and fill that, like she's filling opera houses with this. She's also kind of like filling your head with this. I know I bring him up every single meal, but it's like it's like post-Stravinsky of like life is brutal and life is dark, but where's the beauty in that darkness, and not in a genre way at all, like a witch house sort of thing or whatever, where it's playing to a sort of whatever. It's like really, I don't know. What did you think? What were your very first impressions when you heard it? Like if you could erase some of those, like, because we both listen to a ton of music. Like, what do you think your first impressions would be otherwise?
Yeah, it's, I honestly, it is an album that has grown on me. The first time I listened to it, I'm like, this is interesting. And to kind of pare it back, if I say, if I say the terms, post-industrial opera, and you're like, what the fuck is this guy talking about? Just to pare it back, like if I had to give like a 1 out of 10 explanation of what this album is like, think, there's like 9 Inch Nails, who's like the most famous, potentially the only famous like industrial musician, right? Like household name industrial musician. So you've kind of got like the sound palette of a 9 Inch Nails, again 1 out of 10 explanation, funneled through opera. So there's I believe 3 operatic performers that appear on the record. There's a countertenor, a soprano, and a mezzo soprano, and they're performing this piece while there's this very kind of spooky factory, like, post-brutalist kind of soundscape behind it, with some processed interruptions of Pan Daijing herself. And the first time I was like, yeah, this is interesting. And then like the third or the fourth time I was like, this is really cool, because I like the kind of balance in that we have this very what some would call an antiquated art form that's like not particularly relevant anymore, but it exists and we are aware of it existing. But we think of opera as kind of like, how would I say, like a very human art, right? It's very kind of it's older instruments. It's like the classic string instruments generally, and it's people with their human voices just expressing everything through their voice. And here is like some of that, but with these very modern like electronic soundscapes behind it. I think it's a really interesting contrast. That even if it's, and I like it quite a bit. I don't know if it'll be, you know, like, oh, this is my favorite album of the year, right? Yeah. Because it's something that is very, you kind of have to be in a certain mood to want to put it on and want to listen to this entire, 50-minute uninterrupted piece of work. But I will say that it is unlike anything that I've heard in the past, potentially ever.
Yes, which I would argue, because I agree, in 2022 is pretty high praise of, like, in a world that's like, here are the things that work, so push the button of the things that work. I think that she's managed to create something, because I listen to enough of this sort of stuff, because it's like, again, it's either the Carly Rae Jepsen, and then there's this gulf to like classic, and then gulf to what is the weirdest, ridiculous nonsense that someone is doing. And as sort of a primer for any diners, I would recommend this be like the third thing you listen to. Like, okay, so on a Monday, listen to The Knife has a song called The Coloring of Pigeons. Okay. From, I don't think it's their debut, but a 2010 album. And I think that's like my favorite song of the 2010s, The Coloring of Pigeons.
Interesting.
They take Charles Darwin's like diary writings and make an opera out of it. And so he's talking about the colors of birds in the Galapagos, and it's like beautiful 8-minute track. Then after that, go to Tim Hecker, Love Streams. He did one in 2016 that is very much like this, where it's a lot of opera, classical, distorted sort of stuff. And then, like you said, those will get you like 4 out of the 10 of the way there. And then you get to this, and it's just immediately right off the bat, like, put your head next to like a Camaro engine, and also listen to like whatever that Pagliacci or whatever the Italian opera is with the clown. I think it's this, because we talk about interpreting antiquity. I think there's this, I can't remember how to pronounce it in Japanese. They have this thing where if a pot breaks, you fix it, but you highlight the
breaks.
Yeah, like in gold. I think that she's done the opposite, and I think that's admirable on one side, but then when something breaks, like I just said, like Stravinsky does the Rite of Spring, and someone would say like, oh, that's like a great opera, that's a great symphony, whatever. It's like, it's not. It's a ballet. It is what it is, and it can sound like other things, but it is what it is, and he does it justice. This one, she's saying, this pot has like broken, and I don't know. I'm not a sculptor.
Not a pot maker.
Yeah, I'm not a potist.
A potist.
So I can't put it together. So what can I make out of these pieces? And then you see it, and you're like, okay, that is definitely not a pot. And I actually admire you for that, because it is its own thing that has been, like, appropriation is a deservedly negative word these days, because it's people taking something and claiming that it's organic or claiming that it is what it isn't. In this case, she has reappropriated all the trappings of in crazy industrial German sounds, and then the general ethos or like feeling or whatever you'd want to call it, not vibe or whatever words the kids would use, the energy. Vibes. Yeah, she's got very main character or lead character energy here. She takes those and makes them into something that I could see, metaphorically in the museum there, sitting on the pedestal, that like, this is a this is not an example of this kind of art. This is this artist like defining statement.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to that interpreting antiquity, I think that this is like a crown jewel moment of that, where it's you have to acknowledge the past and revere the work of artists that came before you, and you can only emulate them if you're just as technically versed as them. But if you're not, just take some of the building blocks they gave you, and I'm sure they would want you to make your own thing out of that.
A Minor Diner would be nothing without its sponsors.
Classical music, a celebration of classical music. One night only at the Beacon Theater. Hear the best of Bach, the mastery of Mozart, and the soaring, structuralist stratospherums of Stravinsky. Abandon your world of trash, don your sophisticated attire, and come watch our talented conductor conduct the classics. Be aware that there will be an optional mandatory donation to our art fund, the classics. If you're not intelligent enough for this classical music performance, then don't bother to come to the Beacon Theater this Friday for Classical Music, a celebration.
Welcome to Hypar News, the only blog that is all headlines. We here at Hypar News have developed an ultra-intelligent AI algorithm that develops news before it happens. We know you don't have time to read about Kiev. Neither do we. But we mine Twitter, TikTok and 9gag for the latest hot takes, funnel them into our Hyper News bot's insatiable gob, and spit out the most likely future scenarios. Here's what's happening tomorrow. Genderqueer Vladimir Putin destroys Joe Rogan's vibes. Climate change enforces the patriarchy on Kazakh World Cup team. Dogecoin drops 2022% Academy Awards equals, you won't believe Brazil, and that's a good thing. Hypar News, before then comes after now.
Sometimes here at A Minor Diner, we like to cook with fire. Yes, it can singe us. Yes, it can scald the diners. But sometimes it's important to eat something that burns all the way down. Cooking the type of entree we're going to serve to you here can be dangerous, so let me just reassure you for a moment that you're in good hands. You might not guess it from my bad boy reputation here at A Minor Diner, but I went to church every Sunday for 18 years. Sunday school early in the morning, sermon around lunch. From the time I was 6 weeks old until I was an adult, I'd sit in the pews and listen to the pastor preach to the congregation. I don't really have attention problems, but after the 4 billionth sermon, you kind of get the point, and your mind starts to wander. In every pew, next to the hymnals, there were always copies of the Bible. The preacher would be speaking about whatever subject of the week, but I usually tuned out after 5 or 10 minutes once I recognized where he was going with it and picked up the Bible. I don't know if I could say that I've read the entire thing from cover to cover, because some sections just aren't as interesting to a young boy or teenager, but I have read the grand majority of it. But when I would open up the Bible on these Sunday mornings, I more often than not found myself rereading today's entree, the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, which essentially describes the origin and foundation of the Israelites / Hebrews / Jews. Now, important thing to note, I am not a Christian. I am not an atheist, agnostic, Buddhist, Muslim, Jew, or believer in any religion or lack of religion. I like to think about theology and read about it, but I think a concept as large as the nature of existence is ultimately incomprehensible to the lowly human brain. We tend to oversimplify and oversynthesize anything we come in contact with everyone's religious beliefs very conveniently overlapping with their own personal hopes, fears, dreams, and worries. Mm-hmm. So, for context, the only statement of religious identification that I can make about myself is that, regarding the planet Earth, I don't own the place, I just work here. Interpreting Antiquity. Why would we talk about the book of Exodus? Because I think there are two perfect stories that come out of the Greco-Roman Western world in terms of characters and plot and setting and themes and everything. One of them being Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and the other being the exodus of Hebrews from Egypt.
Interesting.
And so, Mr. Base Chef, if you don't mind telling us, what is the general story of Exodus?
Ooh, the general story of Exodus. And as my disclaimer before I start, when I learned that we would be cooking this book up for you today, I shuddered. A shudder ran through my spine, and I went to the darkest, deepest shelf on my bookshelf. And I moved past all of the spider webs and just like picked up this huge book, did that thing where you blow on the book and like 6 pounds of dust go everywhere in your apartment. I had to vacuum afterwards. And I opened a Bible first time in a while. Exodus is the second book of the Bible. And apologies to any really Christians out there, because this is the Base Chef version of Exodus. I'm gonna leave some shit out. All right, so Exodus is the second book. We've passed Genesis. There's a Pharaoh in Egypt. Pharaoh doesn't like the Israelites. All right, he says any fucking baby boy comes out, we're gonna kill any Israelite baby, right? Except there was a boy gets born, and to save this boy, the mother puts him in a little crib, puts him in the Nile. All right. Thankfully, little Moses, that's this little bugger's name, gets into the hands of the Pharaoh's household. Okay, so is raised in this way. All right. 40 years later, Moses is hanging out in Egypt. God appears to him as a burning bush. Says that it is time to exit Egypt, right? We're going to take all the Israelites. We are going to go to the promised land. We're going to go to Canaan?
Yep, Canaan, yeah.
Canaan, okay.
Or Canaan, sorry.
Canaan. All right, whatever.
I was thinking of the race car driver's name, sorry. Canaan.
So Moses, with the help of his brother, confronts Pharaoh, says, let my people go. Pharaoh's like, nah, bro. So the plagues come upon Egypt. We all know the plagues. They are the most outside of the the entire world ending. This is the second most metal part of the Bible.
Yeah.
Is the plagues of of all shapes and sizes that come upon Egypt. Eventually, the Pharaoh, after each firstborn of Egypt is fucking murdered by God, says, okay, Israelites, you can go. They go, but of course the Egyptians follow. All right. Then there's that parting of the Red Sea. It's very cinematic. He lifts the thing up and the Red Sea parts. They go. They make their thing. They find the 10 Commandments. Am I leaving anything major out?
No, that's good. Yeah. And so I think that this is, no matter what retelling of it is, I think this is the perfect story. It has everything, and it's so resonant. I've written a short story set in Exodus. I've written a feature film set in Exodus. I've written a stage play set in Exodus. The influence it has had on my life is great. And that is great with a lowercase g and not an uppercase one, because the book of Exodus, regardless of your religious beliefs, is a story. Interpreting Antiquity. Why the book of Exodus? There's a quote that you hear about writing and literature that nothing is original except for the Bible and Shakespeare, which is very ironic considering that they're both quite derivative. The book of Exodus is a founding myth created by Hebrews for Hebrews to give them a sense of identity. It is a story. Now, if you're not Jewish, you're probably thinking, this is some degree of blasphemy. Like the Trouble Chef is being very provocative here.
I'm provoked.
Yes. Go ask a Jewish person about Exodus. They will tell you it is a story. It is our story. Now, go talk to a maximalist Christian or Muslim or even an agnostic. No. That actually happened. I read somewhere that they found Egyptian chariot wheels in the Red Sea. The Hebrews were the ones that built the pyramids. Ramses was the pharaoh. Check the history, Jesse. I bring the book of Exodus to the table because, to me, it is a perfect piece of art that has been ruined by a lack of meaningful interpretation. Much like most art that is classic or has survived centuries, It was built, crafted, and honed to perfection over centuries, to the point where it doesn't need historicity, nor can it survive being injected with any. To do so, with any work of art, will destroy it, something I think is happening with increasing frequency. Pan Daijing has a reverence for opera and for the thousands of years of music theory and culture that predates her work. She did not allow her inexperience in the quote-unquote classical music scene to prevent her from seeking betterment by pursuing it. My concern, why I bring the Book of Exodus to the table, is the opposite. There are 3 types of people who read Exodus. The first is a religious person who demands that it be taken seriously as a historical fact. The second is an atheist or non-believer who demands that it not be taken seriously at all. The third is someone who just values the written word and literary value of the text itself, regardless of their religious beliefs. My concern is that this kind of theological trichotomy, where people slowly sifting through the context and resonance of a work itself are being swallowed up by these 2 encroaching dogmas that state that something is either completely true or completely without value, and that this threat is encroaching not just on religious works, but now art of every variety.
Interesting. Just to kind of start out, I was raised semi-religiously. Both of my parents are different shades of Christian, Catholic, pescatarian,
Right.
But anyways, I remember as a kid having my little illustrated Bible. So they gave me, it was called the Beginner's Bible, and it was just like, like 1 out of 10, like God made fish, period, and like all these fancy illustrations. And even as a kid, I remember asking, like, where did these stories come from? Like, who wrote these stories? Like, if this was and I inevitably never really made it that far into the Beginner's Bible because even as a kid, I couldn't really care less about it. But I always read, the beginning couple. Like, I always read Genesis and I always read Exodus. And Genesis, like, didn't make sense to me because it was like, if this is like the origin story, who wrote it down? Why do I have this book? Who was telling this book? It was like always kind of presented as truth in church and by Bible files. Can you call them that? Bibliophiles? That's a book lover.
Yeah, I'd have to. Yeah.
But I, from a very young age, like wondered like where their origin came from, and it's interesting because I never really Googled it back in the day because I was like 5 years old. But now you can
Yeah.
Google it. And Jewish and Christian tradition says, for a long time it was like, well, Moses was the author of Exodus.
Yeah.
Moses wrote this down. But by the end of like the 19th century, people started kind of abandoning that idea and kind of reluctantly saying, well, honestly, it was probably like a bunch of oral traditions and a bunch of written traditions that maybe around 600 BCE, people just kind of put together, and now this is the book that we all know and love.
Yeah, because I was always taught, raised Baptist, that like you're saying with Genesis, of like, okay, well, that is God speaking through others, and so he's like telling this person or that person what to write. And you get to the New Testament and it's like, okay, these are a bit more historically verified figures who like, okay, these are letters that were written from this person to that person. But yeah, there's this general I think, because like taking Exodus as the basically the most exaggerated version of this, that when you're talking about interpreting Antiquity, there's this, let's like Americanize it for a second. You have the South, and the South has this heritage, not hate relationship with their Confederate flag kind of thing. And we look at that today as like a pretty, like, okay, well, there's quite a bit of hate that you have to overlook to get to that heritage. But then if you were to argue that, and by no means would I ever defend the Confederate flag, but to argue that the North and the South didn't have different cultures that had different things that people who were not in the apparatus of slavery or the industry of the North, that they liked that culture they had before their place was burned down to the ground, basically. And of course, it's on the backs of slaves and all these things, because there's this statistic that if you are really being an apologist for the South, you say that 1% of American households had slaves, or 1% of Americans owned slaves. But if you actually recontextualize that to like, okay, what are the actual tangible whatever?
Yeah.
It's that a third of all Southern families had slaves. But then if you're like a poor Southern white person and you like your sweet tea and Southern Gothic architecture and all this sorts of whatever, yeah, to you, you're not ignorant, you're naive. Like the North comes down, does whatever, destroys, and that way of life is gone. But this roundabout, very dangerous conversation I'm getting into
we're
is
playing
like,
with fire today, for sure.
Is like, okay, but the South had a culture in the same way that Egypt had a culture, in the same way that Germany in the 30s had a culture, and people who are not plugged into the actual atrocities of these places, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because sometimes the baby doesn't have a little basket of reeds that he can float down. Like you do need to look for the good and the bad. Like we're talking the Bible here especially. I think it's mostly an American thing. You don't really see this abroad. That word theocratic maximalism means like everything in this is true.
Yeah.
And it's almost one of those things, like the older your religion is, the harder that is to be actually accurate.
Yeah.
Because if you, like I'm reading the Quran, and the Quran is at least post 0 AD. So there's some verified these battles took place. There are historical figures that can be verified. And then Christianity has this half and half thing where, yes, Rome was doing this to Israel at the time, blah, blah, blah. But then you get to Old Testament, the Torah, the Jewish side of things. There are all these parables in the same way that Jesus, is giving parables, but they're taken at absolute face value. And I think almost rightfully so, we kind of condemn this or criticize this of like, surely there's too many contradictions within the text itself. They're just meant to be stories. Some of these can be true. Some of these are stories, whatever. But this is like bleeding into, I guess my area of, I don't want to say expertise, my profession, like films. If I'm watching something, I'm an average viewer and I'm watching something, it either needs to be so fantastical that it could not possibly exist, or a one-to-one reflection of reality.
Oh, okay.
And if it is any mixture whatsoever, for some reason, I have to light my pitchfork and torch, and light my torch and pitchfork and go. Like the Lord of the Rings show that's coming out, Middle Earth or whatever. People are pissy because there are not just white people in this, and there are, there's a diverse cast. And it's this weird, any take I read on it is like completely wrong, And it's like, you'd think it'd be a somewhat black and white issue, but it's like, a lot of this is multiculturalism for the sake of it. A lot of this is racism for the sake of it. A lot of these like takes are like, but you're ignoring the context and material of the Lord of the Rings that like, of course it's multiracial. Maybe this, like an African Swedish person or an African Norwegian person exists, but they're insanely rare. And so if I were to depict a family of Norwegians as being, dark skinned, it would be like, okay, what is the significance of this?
What's the significance? Yeah.
Because otherwise that is an artistic choice. So what I'm getting at by all of these insanely dangerous examples, why not, like when in Rome, we're playing with fire. But like I bring Exodus in because I think it's like perfect. I think story structure wise, it is perfect. But then there's this need for it to be something like I take lessons of humility or bravery or anything from the story. And I think that's the point of the story, is to give the Hebrews a sense of like, well, who are we?
Yeah.
We don't have a homeland. What's our nomadic? Why are we doing this? And it doesn't. Some things have to be true, but like if Plato, if Plato was involved in some unsavory things back in ancient Greece, I kind of care, but it's also been 4,000 years, and so his words are more valuable to me than his like identity.
Aristotle had slaves, I think. One of them did.
Yeah. And so, I guess your general thoughts or what revisiting Exodus, what was that like? I guess through that lens.
I mean, it was superbly actually interesting revisiting that question that I had as a child of like who wrote this and why, and does it matter? Because I remember way back, this was in high school that I read it, and I don't really remember that much of it. But there was a book called The Year of Living Biblically, and it was basically like this American guy who basically for 1 year of his life tried to follow every single rule in the Bible and wrote a memoir about it. And it's like a humor memoir. But it's also superbly interesting because there's all of these things that we take, or not we specifically here at the diner, but like people that are heavy Christians take very seriously in the Bible. And it's like, well, we can't have this in America because it says we can't in the Bible. But if you actually followed every rule and guideline you could find in the Bible, it's essentially impossible, right? Like, because there's some that we've just kind of ignored because it doesn't make sense in our context, but others have been blown out of proportion. And like, so the danger with it, and I guess the reason that I'm also agnostic, but I find theism and religious studies incredibly interesting. The reason that I'm more drawn to a tradition like Buddhism, I guess, because Buddhism, I guess, almost never really claims to be like, well, this is this grand story and this is a creation myth. Like Buddhism doesn't really like have a creation myth, right? Like Buddhism in a more sense is like more applicable in the sense that if we're using the Buddha's words to live our life a certain way, it's honestly just like advice, right? Whereas if we're supposed to take these parables, are we supposed to take these parables as truth? Are we supposed to take these parables as parables? And the danger, I was reading, because you get into the weeds a little bit and you're like, okay, this actually still has real world implications because of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I was reading, this is way back in 2002, but there was a senator from Oklahoma who was giving a speech on the floor of the Senate about, Israel's right to the land. And this is a quote. He says, "I believe very strongly that we ought to support Israel and that it has the right to the land because God said so." And he says in Genesis 13, 14 through 17, quotes the Bible, quotes the Lord saying to Abraham, lift up, all of this land is yours. And he says, that is God talking. This is not a political battle at all. It is a contest over whether or not the word of God is true. And I find that shit fucking terrifying.
Yeah, because that's a couple things there. Yeah, because like I think as with anything, there are. I don't want to defend that guy by any means by saying like, or defend. I would defend Christianity in the same way I would defend Buddhism, where like it is a nice structure and framework.
It changes people's lives. I've seen some really fucking horrible people become less horrible people because they became Christians.
Exactly, and it's like Jonah getting swallowed by the whale didn't need to have literally happened for me to like take like, oh, it's about like faith in bad times that like you're going to endure and recover and get better. There are things like that. That's sort of what I mean. Where if you don't take a rational, self-effacing, like I sort of feel like at the moment, 2020s, people will criticize the world or others or anything for things that they themselves are insecure about.
Yep.
And so the big F word in 2020 is fascism. They're like, global fascism is spreading in this and this and this and this. But also, any contrary opinion to anything ever, or anyone preferring something over something that you identify like, well, I like this artist, but they didn't win a Grammy. This is an affront to my existence.
Me.
Yeah. Like, there needs to be, like, for example, like I've said many times, I like motorsports. I like cars racing. I like all this sort of thing. We can't do that 100 years from now in the same way we're doing now, because it takes petroleum to run the cars, make the tires, do all these sorts of things. So I like something while fully being cognizant of the ways in which it can improve or its flaws. Whereas, like, let's start biblically here, religiously, and then I'll into your point, like, broader. I was hired when I was in China to write a script about Constantine, the Roman emperor, the one who famously switches Rome from like a polytheistic, pagan sort of thing to Christianity. Yeah. And one of the dangers of like, I would challenge Christians, but not in a negative way. But like, okay, you need to like look at the nuts and bolts and the meat and potatoes and whatever other thing I can bring up here of your religion, because you say you believe X, Y, Z, ABC, whatever, the whole thing, to whatever degree and in whatever context. A lot of people don't know about Constantine. And so Constantine is the emperor for like 30 years. And his switch here, both in his personal life and then switching the empire and therefore the Western world to Christianity, basically the shortest way to put it is he takes the West's version of Buddhism, because Jesus is just walking around basically being, I mean, there is a 1% valid argument that Jesus went so far east that he went to India and came into contact with that way of thinking, and that's why he was the way he was. He takes all of that and basically melds that with the state. And so now the state of Rome, which is like the blueprint that we have the state today of any government, he makes that somewhat Christian, and then he goes back into the texts and the beliefs of Christianity and makes that more like the state. And so like any Christian listening to this, if you're getting a bit hot and like bothered by anything that I happen to be saying, look up the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Look up the Edict of Milan. Look up his mom, Helena. Look up the Council of Arles. These sorts of things of, oh, I didn't understand that a bunch of Romans in a government building said this is Christianity, and that it's not actually in the text, whatever this or that element is. And so when you have these people that have a very, in my opinion, the Bible is like a very, very worthwhile book. It's like a very big piece of literature. It's good and bad in whatever ways, but it's like inherently we have to preserve it. Yeah. But if you have this like, it is the greatest thing ever and is sacred, divine, must be followed. Bad. It is worthless. It must be thrown out. There is no value whatsoever in my life reading it. Bad. And so that's on a religious level, because that's easy, because then it's exactly like you say. An elected official saying, yeah, we have to go keep Israel, we have to arm them with missiles and fighter jets because it's, they're God's chosen people. And it definitely has nothing to do with the fact that it would be a wonderful beachhead if we have to invade the Middle East. It has nothing to do with that whatsoever. No. Why would you say that? So, like, I think that general dichotomy of like, because when people leave the church, or religion, they're like hardcore against it. Yeah. And I think that's halfway, I was in church for 18 years and I have my own little like whatever.
But it's a reaction, right?
Yeah. And I think that's the right word. Yeah. I think this is now bleeding down to insane reactionary nonsense by everyone at all times. And like Exodus is the first example of this, because Genesis is just an interesting story in whatever like mythic way.
Other than the implications on women.
Well, it's interesting. I will say that, not good or bad. Yeah. Yes, there's a couple of verses in the Bible, because like you, I would like, I'll start at the beginning and ended up rereading those. There's a couple in Genesis and definitely one in Exodus that like I can look back as like, oh, here's the division point where I started to leave. But I think that this level of I don't think a Buddhist, if you say, I think your religion is stupid and everything you believe is bad and this is bad and the temples are bad or whatever, I don't necessarily, I mean, back historically, yes, they were warlike to whatever degree too, but they don't have the same relationship with this thing that like, I have to defend this work of art, this literature, this whatever, literally with my existence.
Yeah.
In the same way that like Indians, I can't remember exactly which religion, the juggernaut thing, the word juggernaut comes from this, where they'd like march the elephants and the big parade floats into whatever, and then into whatever city, and practitioners of this religion would jump in front and want to be crushed to death because that was a sign of showing faith. That's sort of what I'm getting at, is like, if you're Christian and you have this sort of like relationship with it for 60 years, I can kind of understand psychologically why you'd get so defensive. I think you're getting 15-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 35-year-olds who do this with Spider-Man, where they just literally think, because there's this big controversy now. I think it's a bit ridiculous that the third highest grossing movie of all time isn't nominated for any Oscars. Like, how could Spider-Man not be nominated for anything? And then you have people, myself included, saying, literally, what more do you need? What more validation do you need for this thing that you like? Why can't you just like it? You have complete global culture by the neck. You have all of the box office. Why is it a requirement that people who don't like the thing are forced to validate your thing?
And exactly the same, like, I see it a lot in, this is why I don't spend a lot of time in the weeds of the internet, because there's like, anybody who expresses an opinion. So for example, like an album comes out that is generally universally regarded as good. Any website that includes comments that you can go on, there's always the naysayers that are like, this is just garbage, this is that. I don't understand why anyone would think that this is the best album. And then 16 people complaining about that, and then 16 people complaining about the complaints, and this and that and this and that. And it's like this really, really bizarre. I guess this has been around forever, right? Because if you go back to the Crusades, like, we've got to save everybody because we have the right answer, and these savages, we've got to prove them, we've got to save them, we've got to prove them that they're wrong. So I guess it's maybe human nature, but it feels like such a really, I guess it's a hyper realized version of it these days, because it's always in our face. That it feels like every little thing, even the things that like don't matter at all, like, I don't give a fuck if somebody on the internet doesn't like an album that I like. I could care less. I could care less. Like, I think Spider-Man is stupid, but I don't care if you like Spider-Man, as long as you don't talk to me about it all the time. It's totally fine.
And I think, because I think there's a growing danger of like that opinion is being the middle of this trichotomy that I'm talking about, that's like slowly evaporating and being lost to time there, because it just feels, and I'm a very, simple I'm 30 now, but like,
When did you turn 30?
Event at some point. I can't remember which meal. No birthday cake, but so I like to think about World War II, but it just feels like that. It feels like the 30s, because everyone just always says, oh, the Nazis and then the communists. And then there's also us, where we get into this fervor of like, because we're, it's about liberty and freedom and democracy. And that all just becomes buzzwords that don't actually mean anything. And so if you're not doing this, oh, I didn't know you weren't, you're not an ally. You're not on our side. And I think if you're talking about where the billions of dollars in this spending bill are going to go, or versus not go, that's one degree of passion. Anything else is like this weird, like, you bring up these albums. Like, I haven't pronounced his name out loud in a while. Jill Scott Heron,
I think it's Gil.
I'm giving him too much French influence there.
Gil Scott Heron.
Jill Scott Heron.
I always said Gil Scott Heron. But.
Gil Scott Heron. We'll go with either, somewhere on the spectrum. I love his music, and I think it's really good, and I think it speaks to exactly what he was trying to speak to, of like civil rights and all these sorts of things. I love Marvin Gaye to death, like profound cornerstone of my artistic preferences. There are some of his things where I'm like, this song even on What's Going On is like, this is a bit of lip service of just like whatever. In the same way that someone would say Beyonce's Lemonade, that's like probably one of the best civil rights albums ever made. It's like, okay, you're a little bit young and you don't listen to that many things. I don't need to profoundly take offense to your thing. But I think the problem when you can't close down every website's comment section and you can't also have them be unmoderated. If I were to say, Lemonade is overrated, Lemonade is not quite what you think it is, whatever, there's this, okay, I would have heard that from Donald Trump. And so that means that this person saying this must be this and this and this and this, to the point where it is literally getting insane that these checklists that on every side of everything, that if I'm going to be critical, like my favorite movie, one of my favorite movies of all time, There Will Be Blood, there's 2 lines in that I just absolutely hate. And I would want to like bonk Paul Thomas Anderson over the head with like, why did you put this stupid line in your movie? It's a joke that doesn't play and it's not funny. I don't want the joke. But it's like, that's kind of what makes it real. That's what makes it human. That's what makes it art. And so when you have this thing, like going back to Exodus, there's 2 elements there, like any biblical narrative, that like I can look at Hamlet or Macbeth or anything Shakespearean and it's not real. And so therefore I take value in whatever flaws or virtues the characters have. Exodus, Moses, when he grows up and finds out that he's Hebrew, he doesn't quite know how to feel about that until he sees an Egyptian abusing a Hebrew slave. And then he kills the Egyptian, and that's why he runs out to the wilderness. Now, Christian scholars won't reach a consensus on that. Did he murder that person, or was that like divine, or was that like a fit of passion, or what was the reasoning for that? But like those sorts of things, there are times when Moses does things that are objectively bad, gets whitewashed. There are times when for example, like one of the key verses when I'm like 8 years old that I read and I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Is when the Pharaoh is being like affected by these plagues. And he's like, oh, geez, man, I should maybe I just let them go or whatever. And then 2 or 3 times it says, but the Lord hardened his heart. And I'm like, wait a minute here. Does that mean to say that like, what is the free will in this situation? I'm not using those kinds of words at 8 years old, but I'm like, wait a minute, is this guy, what side is
the Lord on? What's happening?
What is going on? And you can make this claim, and I can, like, if the Old Testament God is different from the new one, where he's just, because he is very different, that's fine. But then if you want the letter of the law of the Bible obeyed to the nth degree, that's bad. If you also want, like, well, these things apply 100%. These other ones, I don't know what to think, so I just kind of throw them out. It's like, yeah, but it's included for somewhat of a specific reason. You're not supposed to be, that's sort of what I'm getting at here by introducing like this antiquity and the way in which you inspect it. It's like, I like Marcus Aurelius and Meditations. Marcus Aurelius is also like the last good emperor of Rome, and kind of, therefore you could argue, leads to some degree of a downfall, because he doesn't help prop up and doesn't help nurture his state enough. I don't discredit 1% of like the text of his work versus what he did. Same thing, I bring him up every single time if it's not Stravinsky or Brian Eno. Morrissey, like on a human being to human being level, I think he's off his rocker. I think he doesn't know what he's talking about, because he was put into one of the most successful bands culturally when he was in his early 20s and sort of has arrested development. I think the Smiths, especially Morrissey's lyrics particularly, are like on a completely different tier to most other music ever released. I think it's like literally the apex of popular art versus enlightened literature art. So when it comes to interpreting antiquity, the Book of Exodus, wonderful story, perfect story. But let's talk about like the actual history of it for a second. Here is very likely the origin of Exodus, the true story. Mesopotamia, one of the first civilizations ever. They have a belief that all things are born from the water. more specifically the sea, especially when the sea parts. Interesting. Fast forward. Sargon of Akkad was a ruler in 2300 BC. He ruled over the world's first empire, which included the territory that would eventually become Babylon and Canaan. He invented a narrative that he was born from lowly beginnings, where his mother had to place him into a basket and put that basket into a river. He then floated down to the place he was destined to rule. This is all recorded in an autobiographical stone tablet that now sits in the British Museum in London. Interesting. Let's keep going. Fast forward. Egypt, at one time, did completely harass and transgress against the people of Canaan. Canaan is exactly where Israel is now. Interesting. Fast forward to 600 BC. Babylon takes over Judah, which was the Israelite kingdom, where Israel is today. Israelites are both taken as slaves and exiled into the wilderness. This event is not only covered in the Bible, but corroborated in a myriad of historical and archaeological evidence. There is an absolute explosion of literature and culture from the Israelites at this time who, now without a home, make an effort to refine and record the centuries of oral stories and myths into something that they can define themselves by as a people. Moses, the defining Hebrew, takes his place as the symbolic figurehead of the people. All differing Jewish texts about the story of the Exodus seem to stop around 400 BC, around this time of exile, where there is one narrative version of Exodus that emerges and is later used as the basis for the stories in the Bible and the Quran. So, when it comes to interpreting Antiquity, the key is to actually look at the syntax of the statement. Interpreting is a verb. Verb means action. Action means effort. Effort means work. Your first thought, your easiest thought, the most convenient thought to what you have and you already believe is not work. It is not effort. It is not action. Antiquity, a noun, which means it's a concept. A concept is something that struggles to stay within its own definition, often expanding or dividing through the winds of time. Interpreting Antiquity means doing the work to wrap your head around something that exists of, for, and in a world that you did not. Shakespeare's Hamlet said, "To be or not to be," whereas the Hebrews' God of Moses asserted, "I am that I am." Though the figures themselves lack tangible existence, can the same be said of their words? Through the arduous process of interpreting Antiquity, or life itself, maybe you will discover that it is more worth your time to base your life on a work's values rather than its accuracies. Now bow your heads and say amen.
So for our entree, we kind of looked at a very, very old piece that is being interpreted to this day. And our dessert is something kind of similar. First, let's go to 1956. A man named Shichiro Fukuzawa released his first novel, which was entitled Narayama Bushiko, which could be translated as like the Ballad of Narayama. And it explores the mythical practice of what they call in Japanese obasute, which literally means abandoning an old woman. All right. Essentially, it's like a legendary story about some Japanese communities that because they were so poor and because they did not have enough wealth and food to go around, when an elderly relative reached a certain age, they were carried by their son, usually, to a mountain or other remote place and then left there to die. This novel didn't really do a hell of a lot in America. It was kind of just popular in Japan. And Fukuzawa's career kind of came to an abrupt end when he published a story in the early 1960s about a leftist like beheading the emperor, which turns out not a great idea.
Wow, I want to read that. Wow.
Yeah, he received death threats for like the rest of his life. The president of the magazine that published it. There was a assassination attempt about him. They killed his maid. It was like all sorts of a big deal.
Wow.
But anyways, so he is not well known in the West, but there were two interpretations of his first story that then became more well known. The first was in 1958, a film adaptation. The second was in 1983, another film adaptation. The 1983 version actually won the Palme d'Or that year at the Cannes Film Festival.
Oh.
But we are looking at the 1958 version, which is slightly less well known, but in my opinion, it's actually more interesting. So directed by Keisuke Kinoshita. Again, not particularly well known in the West, but he was continually looking forward in his film career. He made a bunch of comedies and also some more intense dramas like the one we're looking at today. But one of his first films, Carmen Comes Home, was actually Japan's first color feature.
Oh, wow.
But we're talking about the Ballad of Narayama, which I just told you, the mythical practice of obasite. The film is about the practice of obasite. It's unlike Exodus, where I could talk about paragraphs about everything that happens. Here, it's basically about a small village that's very poor, and there's an old woman whose son is about to bring her to the mountain of Narayama, which is where all of the old people, when they reach 70, are brought.
Right. And this is actually an interesting thing, like watching this, the first 5 minutes, I was like, I was having like an out-of-body experience, because I was like, what is going on here? Like this is like a dream that I've had before or whatever. And then it like finally hits when the rubber meets the road. Uh-huh. When I was in China working theater industry stuff, I would go see plays and not have translation. And so I went in July of 2017 to the Central Academy of Drama, like their Harvard for performing arts. And there's this play where this guy's carrying this old woman on his back all the time.
Oh, funny.
And I'm like, okay, I guess I get enough of this. And then I start seeing this, and it's like, oh, I thought that was a fever dream I had.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And in that regard, you would not think that you could stage this as a play, because it's inherently like, he's got to take an old woman up a mountain to die. But it's kind of based in this kabuki theater sort of style.
Yeah.
And I think that's because if you could speak about, like, I know a little bit about Japanese theater, but kabuki specifically.
Yeah. So kabuki, one of the traditional theater styles of Japan. And this film basically presents itself as if it were a kabuki play. So the practice of kabuki kind of started in, I believe, the 1600s, and then was developed throughout the centuries. Kind of died off. It still exists in Japan as one of those, like, I guess, relics of antiquity that they still kind of practice as like a, wow, look at what we used to be kind of deal.
Like Peking opera.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's not generally, I mean, there probably are, but there's not like huge new kabuki plays coming out every 3 days in Japan. But this film begins, there's this guy that kind of walks on stage, and he's like head to toe in black, and his face is covered. And his name, he is the Joruri, which means like kind of the narrator. So he announces that the title of this film is based on the legend of Obasite. He clacks together some pieces of wood, and then the curtains open, I guess, to this small village. And throughout the piece, I think it's really interesting. The reason I brought this to the table today, if we're interpreting Antiquity, I think it's superbly interesting. The practice of obasite, leaving these old people up on the mountain. There's actually no proof that this actually happened in Japan. It's kind of a legend, like a legendary practice that may have happened, but there's no actual proof that it ever did.
Interesting.
So it's kind of an interpretation of a story that was passed down forever. But I think in the same way that it is dangerous to interpret Exodus as like truth and to kind of take all of its words as literal gospel in this sense, I think it's actually more interesting to look at the past in a heavily stylized way. Because if we are interpreting a period of antiquity that like doesn't actually exist, and if it does exist, we don't actually really know what it looks like, right? We might have some paintings of the time, we might have some interpretations of the time, but being that there are no photographs, being that there are no living people that can tell you how it was, I think the actually most relevant way of basing a story in those times is to actually go above and beyond with the stylized version. And so the director here never really tries to present this as anything but like a play, anything but a movie, right? They've got the Joruri throughout plays these songs on the samisen, which is the traditional, like, I guess the Japanese version of a banjo, basically, playing these kind of banjo tunes, and he's got this really, really inflected voice that he sings every couple minutes. He's got a new kind of verse about what's happening in the story.
Yeah.
And like early on, he's like, some of the song lyrics are like, upon turning 70, one is expected to go to Narayama. It's a long-held tradition of the village, right? So he is narrating everything going on in a voice that in the same way that Pan Daijing is not going to be everybody's cup of tea, I can imagine, like, if I showed my mom this movie, she would turn it off in the first 10 minutes.
Yeah. Because like, functionally, he's like a Greek chorus where he comes out, he doesn't literally, except at the beginning, but he's singing directly to the audience. And yeah, it's in this, like, different scale than we're used to, and it made me laugh so much. Like, I think it's in the first 5 or 10 minutes, because you're classically taught in either playwriting or screenwriting, like, if there's narration, it cannot be what we're literally seeing, because otherwise that doesn't need to be there. And so he does that of, like, singing this song of, like, oh, this is her grandson, and I wonder why he's here and what he has to say. And then he says, hi, Grandma. And that's I don't know if we needed that, but no, but yeah, like, the way in which because I agree with your point. Like, it's dangerous to take like Exodus as a literalness, and then depicting the past is this tricky. I think it's a modern thing because of cameras, basically, that I can literally see what Abraham Lincoln looked like, but not Washington, and so it's an abstract whatever. And the only way to actually engage with that is to acknowledge that. Like, for example, if I were to make a moral or ethical judgment on these people taking their grandparents up to the mountain to leaving them to die, I am not a Japanese person at that time in history, nor even like when kabuki theater is like popular. So there's like these layers and these filters I have to put it through.
Yes.
So if I were to then because I've seen that a little bit. I looked at some comments after watching it of like, oh yeah, but the grandson is this and this person's that. And it's like, I mean, insofar as you could say that about a very abstract it's a completely different planet, basically.
Exactly. And that's kind of what's so interesting about the film. There's a grandson character. So there's a grandma who's very kind, and there's like 20 minutes of the movie is about her teeth.
Yeah, that's when it clicked. I was like, oh, the teeth. And they're like, what? When I was watching the play in Beijing, I was like, what is going on with these, like, this teeth and all this? Like, it makes enough sense because you can tell that he's taking her up the mountain to die or whatever. But so many things that happen in this movie are, that's sort of what I mean. Not to hijack, I'll throw it back to you, but like, I didn't have, the first time I ever exposed to the story had literally nothing but like their body language and general way of whatever. Now knowing all of the context, it's really only 1 out of 10 more knowable to me. Totally. There's I can have general empathy, but it's not something, I don't literally live in this environment.
Because that's the character motivations in this story. Literally just like they seem completely alien to me. Like there are character decisions every point of this story that just like fundamentally are very, very different than how I would react to a situation.
Yeah.
And that's like, it's partially the over stylized, like kind of over the acting performances aren't super over the top, because like if you were to watch an actual kabuki play, like the acting itself is also going to be like incredibly over the top.
Yeah.
And here they have that a lot less. It's kind of an interesting thing because it's got like this kabuki like backdrop, and the sets are very like, this is a set.
Yeah.
But the people in the story are actually kind of pretty rooted in reality, except their character motivations don't make any sense to me. Like the grandson as a character doesn't make sense to me. They keep singing songs about teeth, and it doesn't make sense to me. People cry, and I don't really know why they're crying. And people get married just because they're the same age, and like everything is really, it's a really bizarre look into an antiquity that I have no basis or root in whatsoever.
Yeah, and there's like 2 points to exactly echo that. Like, I think that it's looking at these 3 dishes now. Yeah, like what is your take on opera if you're going to make an opera? Well, opera doesn't have even remotely the same cultural mechanisms, the cultural influence, resonance that it used to.
Yeah.
So anything you're doing is a very insanely broad assumption. And Pan Daijing, great job. And then Moses, it's like, this is literally like a Bronze Age tale of whatever, already told by people that are hundreds of years later.
Yeah.
And so it's all in retrospect, might as well have narration. And then same sort of thing with this. There's a movie I'll eventually bring in as a dish, The Last Samurai, where it's, yeah.
I've never actually seen it, so that day is
Save
the day.
it for sure, yeah. Because it gets these, similar to like Dances with Wolves, it gets this like rap by people that haven't seen it, or people who have seen it and really want it to be about this thing. But it's basically about Japan changing, Meiji Restoration sort of stuff. And there are praises and condemnations about its historical accuracy, whereas I look at it and it's like, it's a tale.
Yeah.
Like, because you as an American or even a Westerner are talking about several worlds ago. Like, you can't relate to the late 1800s, and neither can Japanese people.
No.
So we're looking at a very abstract depiction of this.
Totally.
And to quote your point about the sets and everything, absolutely adored every shot of this movie. The way the sets are composed, and like how many different ones there are, and how artificial it is technically, but also looks better. It's like you clearly shot on a set because you could make the lighting insanely perfect. And for like any diners, picture Wizard of Oz, like how Wizard of Oz looks, where it's like not cheesy and fake and artificial looking. It just looks fairy tale.
It looks created.
Yeah,
right?
and I think that's something sorely lost in a sort of antiquity sort of way. I think I haven't seen the 83 one or the 88 one or whenever. I bet they shot on location and did all this sort of stuff to make it look as naturalistic as possible. I bet literally by virtue of, does the image look good and does it tell a good story, I bet it doesn't have as good a cinematography as this one does.
It's very different. I've only seen it once, and it was a long, long time ago. So if I misinterpret it, I apologize. But it is from a director named Shohei Imamura, who was part of the kind of Japanese new wave, which I've seen one other of his films, which is called Black Rain, which was basically... Black Rain is a fucking sad movie.
Oh,
my
wow.
God. It's set in Hiroshima.
Okay.
Beginning of the movie, Hiroshima gets nuclear bombed, and then the rest of the story is like this surviving family. Like, they don't die in the initial bombing, but they're like slowly dying because of radiation poisoning.
Yeah.
And it's showing like this entire village just like slowly dying off, or quickly dying off by some rates of radiation poisoning.
Wow.
But it's presented like very like kind of matter of factly, like I guess, realist style. And the 83 version of the story is very similar in the sense that, it's like it's realism over
I see.
over interpretation, I guess. Which I don't know. I personally prefer this version. The kabuki stylings can be over the top, but I think it's the idea of the film itself is like such a bizarre fucking thing that it's like we are interpreting an old tradition. I don't know exactly what century this was supposed to be happening in, the Obasate.
Yeah.
But like an antiquated tradition, a legendary tradition, we are interpreting a 1950s book on that tradition, and we are going to interpret it through the lens, for whatever reason, of kabuki, which may have been, I guess, popular around the same time that Obasate like supposedly existed. I guess that was the idea. But it's like it's such an interesting kind of like cavalcade of these different time periods coming together and like forming this strange being. Just like Tissues by Pan Daijing is very. I'm not sure I've ever heard anything like it. I'm not sure I've ever seen another movie that was like The Ballad of Narayama.
Yeah, I agree. Because it has it's also the way in which it's cut, especially to the music. Like there are so many moments. I won't give away this certain moment. There's a moment when he's up on the mountain, and something happens, and I was like, oh, that's like a 1930s sort of move of like that thing that just happened to that person, like just happened, and it was like really stark and really like uncomfortable to see. But you couldn't do that. I mean to say you couldn't do that today because the way in which you would stage it and film it would
have to be more dramatic. Like it would have to be, I guess, shown more.
Yeah, and like there's a bluntness to the way this happens. It's like, oh, geez, and like, oh boy, when not to give anything away, but at the top of Narayama there, the mountain, I was like, this is like a movie. This is like, I cannot even believe like some Japanese audience watching this in the 1950s. Like, this is insane. This is like the way in which, that's sort of what I mean, where it's not, I guess maybe that's an interesting way to frame the discussion or because I agree. It's almost like, we've talked about this before, like paintings. No one is really admiring or producing photorealistic paintings because we don't want that anymore because it's like there's no use for that. And so they've understood that the artist's fingerprints and depiction need to be over everything. But like writing or plays or movies or music even, like there's a little bit like I spoke of in the entree, there's this, I would argue, lack of imagination or lack of courageousness that comes with, like, if you're going to depict something, just really take it all the way, because and clash with styles and do all this sorts of stuff. Because if you're trying to present your fiction as close to nonfiction as possible, it's almost really patronizing and annoying, not only to the people depicted, but also the people watching it. Because like, I can't remember if it's the Inuit or someone in like northern, what is today Canada, but they would practice infanticide, where they would kill newborn kids. And there was some like Europeans coming into contact with them and like, this is insane like sending letters back home and whatever. But then it's like, yeah, because when winter comes and there's literally only this much food, sure, the baby was born in August or something like that. There is not enough. There are too many mouths now. And I think, like, for example, if I were to make a movie about that, do I have the right or not right to make a movie about that is one thing. But also, if I were to depict it, you would want to, almost like you're saying, have the song and dance and the color and the whatever of it just be pretty bold and pretty stylized and dramatic, because it just seems like you and I are of the age. If I were to watch a movie about 9/11, it's like there's a lot of 9/11 footage. You better do something. And I think the risk of like, well, I don't want to be disrespectful or offend anyone. And it's like, well, in the same way that Michael Bay can make Pearl Harbor or whatever. It's like he can do that because they're all almost dead, and so no one's going to get offended. If you do, it seems like there's this weird invisible shelf life that people, if I want to depict what's happening in Kiev, it better be brown and gray and real and whatever. But if I'm depicting Normandy, then it can be a Technicolor, musical all of a sudden.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. But I think taking the Technicolor musical route almost in a sense like cushions you from criticism a bit more.
Which it should.
Which it should.
Yeah.
But I have how would I say? I guess a pet peeve of people if you watch a film with people, and certain people are worse at this than others, but the people who, well, that can't really happen. Well, this is the blah, blah, blah.
I wouldn't have done that.
I can't fucking stand those people. But also, like,
yeah,
I guess I don't know these people personally, but there are people on the internet that are like, well, this isn't the actual time period, and this isn't real, and this isn't that. And I think you're just like pulling at straws because these are stories and it doesn't actually matter, and it is an artistic interpretation. So to just shield yourself from all of that, but also to kind of just make your thing more interesting. Like, I'm not saying all films should be like this, but like, I think more period pieces should go for this style than like trying to interpret it as closely as we possibly can.
Yeah, because I think that there's a Lawrence of Arabia is depicting something that happened about, that's World War I. So that's like 40-ish years before its time of whatever. And so it's very stylized and very interesting and very whatever. A movie like, I think it's called Churchill or Darkest Hour, the one with Gary Oldman playing Winston Churchill.
Oh, okay.
They play that so straight that it's like, okay, when's the part where you mentioned that he starved the Indians? Like he started enacting a genocide against Indian people. Because if you're, like, you can do, like, the King's Speech is pretty stylized. And so you can avoid a lot of, like, this is a depiction. If this real-life figure was slightly more caricaturized or whatever. Whereas when you do, like, exactly like you were saying, I watched Drive My Car the other day, and I thought it was like beautiful and amazing and wonderful 3-hour movie about, very slow, whatever. And then the official Instagram account of the distributor posted like a scene where you scroll through and see what the two people are saying to one another. Okay. And there was this Australian guy who's like, dialogue sucks. Typical though, because I can't remember how you pronounce his name, the author of the book that it's based on. Typical this guy, like it sucks, is bad. And everyone under that is like, great job, bud. Like, just like, yep, thanks for contributing or whatever. Because it's like removed completely from context. Of course, it seems all dialogue ever seems contrived and trite and bad. And I think there are moments in this film that just like blew my mind, the transitions especially. Oh, yeah. Because in the way, like, it's the perfect play/movie combination ever. Like, you have someone remaking Shakespeare every 5 minutes, and it's always stifled, boring nonsense because they're filming a play, basically. This is like, what if we filmed a play so hard that it like kind of broke the barrier between film and movie? Totally.
Yeah. And I think more Shakespeare adaptations would be like worth a shit if and there are, I guess, stylized Shakespearean variations, but like, yeah, I don't need like the tragedy of Macbeth. And I haven't seen it, but like, I'm assuming just based on like the poster I saw that it is browns and grays and the story just presented as the story, and it's like, I don't need it. I don't need that.
Have you ever seen Kurosawa's, I just watched it, Ran?
I actually never have.
Okay, I just saw it the same day as Drive My Car, so it was like 6 hours of Japanese.
Wow, you just sat, dude.
Yeah, I was having a day. Yeah. It is based on whichever, I'm at a loss for words, whichever Shakespearean play, but then also based on these historical figures in Japan, and he sort of melds the two together. It is not, what is the name of the the play, the Shakespearean play about it's a guy, King Lear. Thank you, King Lear, and about this guy, this emperor who's gonna bequeath his kingdom to his 3 sons, and how the 3 sons basically fight. Not Shakespearean, he does his own thing with it. Not historical, does his own thing with it. But after watching it, I was like, I have a better understanding of the Shakespearean text and a better understanding of the historical context of this thing, because it's his interpretation of antiquity is almost like, I guess maybe there has to be an artistic point or an artistic statement or theme. Like he has a point that he's trying to get across, not like, oh, I'd love to film samurais doing whatever. And I think when you get something like this, because it reminded me I was trying to put myself in the head of someone who would not like this, like you're saying, listening to whatever. I think there's a interesting grace and like poignancy that he puts across, because there's sometimes some kids in the movie or younger people. There's something about like growing up and your mortality and accepting your mortality. And there was something admirable in my mind about the process, like almost Sisyphus, carrying your own parent to their demise that they've also prepped for. They know they're going to be 70 one day and do this. And I think you'd look at this, and it is inherently barbaric to a 2022 perspective, but then it's like, is he not just taking her to a retirement home? Like, is this not just literally exactly mankind on a loop, basically?
Yeah.
So yeah, when it comes to interpreting antiquity in this regard, without any spoilers, actually, what did you think of the ending? Literally the last 3 shots. I was like,
it's really bizarre.
I don't know the significance of this.
Yeah, without giving anything away, the last few shots of the film are the only shots in the entire film that are not set on a set.
Yeah.
Like, it's very briefly set on location, very briefly what I believe is supposed to be modern day. It's just a shot of a train. That doesn't give anything away. It's a shot of a train.
Yeah.
But I wonder how I talk about this without... It doesn't give anything away. There's really not that much to give away about this story. Like, did I read the 1-sentence plot description? Because that's what the fucking...
You know when he takes her to the
fucking movie is about.
Yeah, he takes her to the mountain. This is the scene where he takes her to the mountain. Yeah.
But then at the very end of the film, it's modern day all of a sudden, and there's a train going past. I guess the train is supposed to probably symbolize that it's modern day. But then the last shot is a wooden sign that says obasite, the abandonment of old women, or whatever in Japanese. I don't know if it's supposed to be I guess good thing we're finally past that, or if it's supposed to be the complete opposite, we're not past this.
Yeah, still doing it. Yeah, because there's that famous anecdote where they filmed the train at the train station for people in 1903, and they all kind of recoil and shock that they think the train's gonna hit them. That was me when all of a sudden there's a train on screen after an hour and a half. I was like, what is because I was enraptured with going
because the end of the
mountain.
movie is beautiful.
Oh, it's so
fucking
good.
Gorgeous.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden there's a train, and I'm like The Village, the Shyamalan movie. I was like, wait a minute, what was this is this what happens outside of Tokyo now?
Yeah.
But so I thought, in regards to, again, interpreting antiquity, that everyone likes history, and everyone takes lessons from history, but you really have to take the whole lesson from history. And I think that Ballad of Narayama is the perfect way to almost put some sugar on that medicine a little bit.
I think the reason that I think it's an interesting film is that instead of trying to interpret antiquity in a very base level, this is literally what happens.
Yeah.
I think the film kind of takes the moral core of the legend and the moral core of this story and puts the moral core above everything, right? Like everything is about this. Everything is about this, I guess, theme. Everything is about this idea. And then the historical context is kind of secondary, and we can kind of make some big swings here with how we interpret that. In the same way that Pan Daijing interprets opera in her own very specific, mountainous region of China upbringing, and the way that I think one should interpret Exodus, in that we can take the morals of the story, we can take the ideas of the story, and interpret it in our own lives. And if that didn't do it for you, also on the menu this month, Black Country New Road, Ants from Up There. The artsy British 7-piece deliver on the promise of their debut album, bringing us a healthy, well-crafted mixture of post-rock, post-punk, and post-whatever else.
Mondo Grosso, Big World. A wonderful collection of Japanese artists came together to put out a stellar album that may constantly cross genres and themes, but is insanely cohesive and calming to boot.
Infinity Frequencies, Exit Simulation. The first release in 4 years from the Mexican vaporwave producer. Sounds kind of like The Caretaker making a Mallsoft album. And really, honestly, what more do you want from your music?
Jean-Michel Blay put out Au Bad. Absolutely sublime French-Canadian classical music. His fourth album provides the perfect space to stop and contemplate life and love. It has been a pretty good month.
Yeah.
You can listen to these among a big collection of every other dish we've ever featured in the restaurant here on our Spotify playlist, A Minor Diner Dishes. It's been interesting to hear some people's reactions to that playlist. If you put it on shuffle, it kind of goes.
It gets weird real fast.
One spectrum to the other.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been good. I've had a good time. I guess maybe before we go, we tend to have them come back to the kitchen.
We tend to.
I guess
we continue the tradition.
The opposite of an exception. We will play to the status quo.
So, yes, every month we ask a question of our diners, and we love hearing your answers to these questions. Last month's question was, what piece of art best defines you? Kind of a big one.
Yeah.
You want to read it, or you want me to?
Sure, I'll read it. I can read her handwriting. Stephanie from Washington says, this might be an odd choice for something that defines me, but I'd have to say the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It was the first movie, or art piece in general, that kind of felt like an interpretation of the weird thoughts going on in my head. The community around the midnight showings also was the first time I became part of something based around one single movie. Yeah, that's an interesting one that has not ended up on... It's on my list. I have not seen it yet, actually. Yeah.
I've actually only seen it at like a live, where they're putting it on and people are dancing and being...
Throwing spoons. That's The Room.
Yeah. But I honestly kind of want to watch it just by myself, because I had no idea what was going on because people kept shouting around me.
Oh, sure. Watching two movies at once. Yeah. What would you say? Like, if there was one piece of art to define you?
Dude, that's so hard. I guess I was thinking about this, and I feel like if we're talking in terms of vibes, if I was to create a overall vibe of what I think of myself as a person as, it would be like a third like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, a third Drive,
sure, yeah,
and then a third like really gory zombie movie like Peter Jackson's Dead Alive. That'd be my sprinkling.
I could see that now that you say that out loud. Yeah, I could see that combination. Similarly, yeah, I would pick a movie because I thought about this when we first gave the question to the diners. So I was like, oh wow, to distill it down into one thing. And then like 30 seconds later was like, oh, duh, it's just Fantasia. It's just,
Oh, of course
it's like very artsy fartsy. Let's bankrupt the studio by making classical music, hippos dancing. And it's like, yeah, it worked for me at 5. It works for me at 30.
Yeah. Or if we're talking more akin to my real vibe, it would probably just be fucking School of Rock.
I could halfway see that. I think you would end up at the school showing them, I'm trying to think of some of the more abrasive stuff we've talked about, where it's like some weird Polish experimental mental institution music rather than like Led Zeppelin.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But anyway, we love hearing from our patrons. We like to bring some kind of thought-provoking questions for the chefs back here, as well as for us. So after this meal, we want to know, what time in history do you like to see depicted in art today?
So if you're reading a story, watching a movie, playing a video game, anything, like what is the time period other than now, but something that is being made now? Is it always nice to go back to World War II or medieval times, prehistoric times? It could be a specific year, a general time frame, but what sort of excites you? What's a excitable, interesting aesthetic or interesting vibe, we'll say.
God, we love
from
the vibes
history.
here at A Minor Diner. If you would like to answer this question, you can write into us at aminordiner@gmail.com, or on our Instagram, or on our Facebook, or comment on YouTube. You can now also send a 30-second to 1-minute audio answer to that same email address, aminordiner@gmail.com.
And if it's like an early 20th century thing, you can send your 1-minute phonograph recording, Edison cylinder recording. But thank you all for dining with us tonight. We've loved having you here, as always. Be sure to thank your hostess, Miss Mandy Groves, on your way out. And wave to Edward Tart on keys, killing it as always. Mm-hmm. And we're not going to take him up the mountain anytime soon.
Nope.
A Minor Diner is recorded on location and produced by Epicene Motion Picture Company. Take care, everyone.
Goodbye.